December 1942. Bizerte docks, Tunisia. The harbour trembled under a sky the colour of burnished tin. Winches clattered, cranes groaned, and Liberty ships exhaled their metallic breath as hatches swung wide. The air reeked of diesel smoke, brine, and something sharper gasoline, raw and sweet as ether. From the decks of the SS James Bowie and SS William T. Sherman, a procession of American tanks descended by sling and cable M3 Lees and the newer M-four Shermans, each dripping seawater, each landing with a shudder that made the ground quiver. To the two Wehrmacht officers watching from behind the wire, Hauptmann Karl Eckhardt and Oberleutnant Felix Römer, the sight was almost theatrical. They had been captured 3 days earlier near Matur, quartermasters rather than front-line soldiers, more accustomed to ink and ration tables than to mud. But even they understood what they were seeing, an army not merely supplied, but flooded with supply. Barrels stacked 5 high. Fuel cans stretching in ranks as neat as parade formations. An American ordnance sergeant barked orders to a crew of tankers, and hoses came alive, hissing. Gasoline surged through canvas and steel mouths into open hatches. Men smoked within 10 paces of the operation, unbothered by fumes that would have made any German supply officer faint. A cook rolled a mobile galley between rows of armoured hulls, the air filling with the comforting smell of bacon and black coffee. The scent mixed with gasoline vapour until the entire dockyard smelled like war and breakfast. "They are filling tanks with benzene," Eckhardt whispered, unable to believe it. "Not trucks, tanks." Römer, who had spent a season refitting Panzer IIIs in the Ukraine, squinted. "Maybachs also run on gasoline," he said quietly, naming the heart of Germany's armoured divisions. But he knew that was not the point. German tank units burned gasoline too, but they did so carefully, counting every litre, siphoning, rationing, hoarding. These Americans were bathing in it. Across the quay, an M4 with fresh olive paint and the name Arkansas Angel stenciled on its turret idled, while a mechanic in rolled sleeves checked plugs and timing. "She likes the good stuff," the man grinned to his partner. 87 octane, just like my Buick back home." His partner laughed and took a long drink from a tin mug. The sound carried faintly across the harbour, too casual for men at war. Römer translated for Eckhardt, who frowned, then said, "They fight a mechanized war with automobile fuel." He stared at the mountains of drums marked US Army, gasoline, motor, 80 octane. "Do they have no fear of shortage?" The Marine guard leaning on his rifle caught enough of the tone to answer. "Shortage? Mister, we got more where that came from." Eckhardt looked at him as one might study a prophet of madness. "More," he repeated, tasting the word. In Germany, more was never available. Fuel was a thing weighed, measured, guarded by sentries, rationed to hospitals and training schools alike. A panzer regiment received its monthly issue like a sacrament, and here were these men smiling, joking, spilling gasoline onto the planks and wiping it away with rags already soaked. The noise of engines swelled as the Shermans rolled off the dock onto Tunisian soil, treads clanking over temporary steel ramps. Each tank carried a 500-horsepower gasoline engine that drank nearly a gallon for every mile. Each engine represented what the German General Staff considered extravagance beyond reason. "This cannot endure," Eckhardt said. "They cannot keep these monsters fed across an ocean." But he was wrong. They already had. Beyond the harbour lay a sprawl of olive-drab trucks, GMCs, Studebakers, Dodges, each with canvas tops and stencil codes like hieroglyphs. The trucks moved ceaselessly, loading drums, hauling crates, refilling tanks that had only just been filled. It was not a supply chain. It was a tide. Römer's mind reached for arithmetic. One M4 burns 60 litres per hour at road speed, twice that in sand. Multiply by the hundreds of tanks he could see, add the trucks, the half-tracks, the jeeps, it was lunacy. No nation could fight like this, not for long. Yet here they were, cheerful in their waste. A corporal tossed an empty can aside, where it clattered and rolled. Another used his knife to pry open a crate marked "spare parts, engine plugs," Ford GAA. Ford, he recognized the name from pre-war advertisements in Berliner Illustrierte Zeitung, automobiles, tractors, assembly lines. It struck him that the same nation that built pleasure cars for its citizens now built armored divisions with the same methods. Perhaps, Römer murmured, this is why they are winning. Eckhardt shook his head. No one wins by wasting fuel. But as he said it, a column of freshly fueled Shermans rumbled past, each carrying 5 men and enough gasoline to run a German battalion for a day. The tankers waved to the dockhands. One shouted, "See you in Tunis," and the others whooped. The air shimmered with exhaust, and the scent of gasoline thickened until it felt like a physical fog. Eckhardt coughed. "They will burn their own supply dry," he said. "Then they will learn." Römer didn't answer. He was thinking of the reports he had typed months before panzer divisions stalled in the steppe, not from battle damage but from empty tanks. The Soviets had learned to strike fuel columns first. He wondered if these Americans feared such things. Looking around, he saw no fear, only momentum. A nearby loudspeaker crackled. "Convoy 12, proceed to assembly yard. Convoy 12," and as if on cue, a new line of trucks began to move, each one filled with nothing but fuel. The Marine Guard grinned. "That's the next batch, fellas. Don't worry, we won't run out." Later that afternoon, as the sun bled into the Mediterranean, the captured officers were marched past the storage yard. The scene burned itself into Eckhardt's mind. There were fields of drums, stacked like a city of metal, painted in dull red and black, each marked gasoline, motor. The smell was overwhelming. Guards smoked, drivers joked, cooks ladled stew beside engines that idled for warmth. Gasoline had become the background scent of existence. Römer stopped and looked back once more at the dock. "They fight a war with coffee and gasoline," he said softly. "One warms their hands, the other moves their world." That night, in the prisoner compound, Eckhardt wrote a note in the margin of his interrogation form. "Americans treat fuel as water." It was not meant as poetry. It was a record of disbelief. Months later, that note would be quoted in a German logistics briefing before Operation Citadel. It would circulate among staff officers who shook their heads and said, "The Americans are fools. Gasoline burns." But beneath the laughter lay unease. For even then, they had begun to hear stories from North Africa that wherever the Americans went, the air smelled faintly of fuel, and that their tanks, impossibly, ran on it and never ran out. January 1943. Near Tebessa, western Tunisia, a thin frost lay on the ridges, the kind that made metal ring when struck. Along a dirt strip where American tanks refueled before dawn, the air shivered with the harsh purr of engines waking to life. Flames flared briefly from exhausts, blue against the desert cold, and then the low thunder began a mechanical heartbeat that rolled across the valley like distant surf. Captain Paul Hendrickson, of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, stood beside his M-four Sherman, helmet pushed back, clipboard in hand. "Start 'em all, let 'em warm slow," he called. Around him, tank commanders moved through their rituals: choke, throttle, ignition, the Continental R975 radial, engines 9 cylinders, air-cooled, originally designed for aircraft coughed and roared, each running not on diesel but on high-grade motor gasoline. To any German officer, it would have seemed madness. In Europe, gasoline was precious, volatile, and rationed even for the Luftwaffe. Diesel, denser and safer, was the soldiers' fuel. Yet here stood the Americans, lighting gasoline by the ton before breakfast. The decision was not accident but doctrine. The U.S. Army had chosen gasoline engines for tanks long before Pearl Harbor, guided by an industrial truth. America could produce refined gasoline faster and in greater quantity than any other nation on Earth. The same refineries that filled civilian cars could fill tanks. The same trucks that carried farm fuel could haul military drums. It was a logistics revolution disguised as convenience. German intelligence analysts studying captured manuals in early 1943 struggled to comprehend the logic. A report from Abwehr summarized the discovery. U.S. Panzerwaffe employs motor petrol engines throughout, perhaps to simplify production, though this is inefficient and dangerous. The abundance of their supply system must be extraordinary. Extraordinary was an understatement. In 1942, American refineries produced more than 1.5 billion barrels of crude oil, nearly 2/3 of the world's petroleum. From Oklahoma to Texas, Louisiana to California, refineries ran day and night, feeding a network of pipelines and rail cars that funneled fuel to coastal ports. From there, Liberty ships carried it across the Atlantic in an unbroken chain. When the British tanker Empire Norseman docked at Bizerte that January, it offloaded 4 million gallons of motor gasoline, enough to sustain 2 armoured divisions for a month of continuous operations. German field units on the Eastern Front, by comparison, fought entire campaigns on half that. Fuel meant movement, and movement meant tempo. An American tank battalion could advance 50 miles in a day, refuel, and do it again. It was not elegant warfare, it was arithmetic. When engines drank too deeply, the answer was not conservation, but more tankers. Supply, not subtlety, was the secret. That same winter, German prisoners captured near Kasserine were astonished to learn that the Shermans they faced carried engines originally built for airplanes. A flying motor? One asked incredulously during interrogation. You fight with engines that should be in the sky? Yes, replied the American interpreter, and they fly low. The Continental Radial was just one of several hearts that powered the Sherman family. Some rolled with Ford's 8-cylinder GAA, a gasoline engine born from an abandoned aircraft design, 450 horsepower of cast aluminum and Detroit precision. Others carried Chrysler's A57 multibank, an ungainly cluster of 5 automobile engines grafted together, like mechanical organs sharing one bloodstream. To German engineers, it was an affront to craftsmanship. To American logisticians, it was genius. Every factory that could build car engines could build tank engines too. In a captured letter from a Wehrmacht maintenance officer to his superior, dated March 1943, one line stood out. The Americans appear to consider petrol inexhaustible. They drive as if the world were a filling station. He was not wrong. At every forward refueling point, barrels were stacked like bastions, hoses coiled like serpents. Trucks idled while drivers smoked, waiting their turn to drink. The smell of gasoline hung perpetually in the air on uniforms, in canteens, in the dust itself. German soldiers, raised in an army where a company might be immobilized for lack of 10 liters, could not fathom such extravagance. They were taught that mechanization was fragile, dependent on ration tables and horse teams. The Americans had rewritten that. Scripture. Their tanks moved not by strategy, but by supply chain momentum, a physics of abundance, and yet there was danger in every breath of it. Gasoline burned hotter than diesel, ignited faster, and made the Sherman notorious among its own crews. Tankers joked grimly about Ronsons, the cigarette lighters that light every time. In truth, most fires came from penetrating hits, not from the fuel itself, but fear was part of the smell. Still, the crews accepted the risk because they could replace tanks faster than Germany could build them. A single American factory, Detroit Arsenal, produced more Shermans in 1943 than all German Panzer IVs and Panthers combined that year. Each one rolled out fueled and ready, its gasoline engine already proven by hours of bench running. The same pipelines that filled bomber wings at English airfields also fed these tanks. The same octane that powered a P-47 Thunderbolt now powered a tank crawling across Tunisia. By spring, the German staff began referring to this phenomenon with bitter humor. In one captured memo from the Afrika Korps, the enemy's mobility is powered by miracles of motor spirit. Motor spirit gasoline had become synonymous with American warfare. Back at Tabessa, Captain Hendrickson watched his tanks line up for departure. He pulled a rag from his pocket, wiped grease from his hands, and sniffed the air. The faint sweetness of gasoline lingered, mixed with the cold. It was the scent of progress, of risk, and of something larger, an economy so vast it could afford to make fire its servant. To the Germans, it smelled like insanity. To the Americans, it smelled like victory. March 1943. The Kasserine passes were still blackened where retreat and pursuit had traded fire. Spring rain fell in mist, turning the wadis into brown veins that fed the larger arteries of war roads. Along those roads, endless convoys moved east. Trucks, tankers, half-tracks groaned uphill through mud that smelled faintly of fuel. To the Americans, the odor was familiar and comforting. To the Germans, captured or observing from the hills, it seemed unearthly, an army perfumed with gasoline. The symbol of that power was not the tank or truck itself, but the humble container that fed them the 5-gallon gasoline can. It stood only 18 inches high, but it represented the lifeblood of industrial warfare. In 1941, when American observers first examined captured German jerrycans from North Africa, they were astonished. The German design was perfect: seamless welds, triple handles, an air pocket for expansion, a wide mouth that could pour fast without splashing. The War Department immediately copied it. By 1943, American factories were turning out thousands every day. Quartermasters joked that they were making as many cans as bullets. The new container was democratic. It moved by hand, truck, ship, or rail. It stacked like bricks and required no pump. Each can held 5 gallons, enough to move a Sherman 1 mile. A battalion needed hundreds for a day's advance. The arithmetic was merciless, but the Americans had accepted it. Their logistics officers did not seek to conserve fuel. They sought to move it faster. At a depot near Tebessa, Private Frank D'Amico of the 3rd Armored Division worked a detail unloading fuel cans from a convoy. The trucks came from Algiers, 300 miles away, each carrying hundreds of cans. They had burned a third of their cargo just to reach the front. "Doesn't matter," his sergeant said, waving another truck forward. "We'll get more, always more." The Germans who raided such convoys learned the same lesson. In one intercepted report to the Afrika Korps, Oberleutnant Kurt Reiser wrote bitterly, "Even when we destroy 20 or 30 fuel trucks, replacements appear the next morning. The enemy fights a war of gasoline. It is as if they pump it from the ground wherever they go." In a sense, they did. Behind every drum and can in Tunisia lay an invisible empire of oil: Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, California, linked by refineries, pipelines, railroads, and liberty ships. At Port Arthur, tankers filled day and night, loading millions of gallons of 80-octane motor gasoline bound for North Africa. Each ship carried the energy of a panzer army. Each day, more ships followed. American planners spoke of pipeline tonnage, a phrase the Germans found incomprehensible. It meant that the U.S. logistics system operated not by shipment, but by flow, a continuous stream of fuel across oceans, through ports, into drums, onto trucks, and finally into tanks. There were no shortages because there was no pause. The system moved like a circulatory network powered by industrial heartbeats. In April, Colonel Hal Standish of the U.S. Army's petroleum section inspected forward supply dumps near Gafsa. The site sprawled across 4 acres fields of drums stacked 3 high under camouflage netting. He recorded the scene in his log: stockpile 3 million gallons, of which 1/3 motor gasoline. Enemy air attack risk moderate. Dispersal continues. Morale of troops high. Smell of gas everywhere. That smell was more than physical, it was psychological. It told soldiers that movement was possible, that retreat could be reversed tomorrow. When a truck stalled or a tank sputtered, there was always another can within reach. Engineers carried fuel the way infantry carried ammunition. A sergeant once said that the first man we lose in a column isn't the one shot, it's the one who runs out of gas. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the Fuel Ministry reviewed captured Allied equipment reports with disbelief. A summary for March 1943 concluded, Americans use motor gasoline for all vehicles and even for light tanks. This is logistically unsound and would be impossible for us. Their supply capacity must be tenfold ours. The writer could not know the truth. It was closer to 20-fold. For Germany, every litre required political conquest, Romania's oil fields, synthetic plants, hydrogenation factories. For America, it required only gravity and steel oil rising from wells, flowing through pipes, refined by heat and chemistry into endless, identical cans. German officers who surrendered in Tunisia often cited fuel as the difference between life and death. One Oberfeldwebel, interrogated in May 1943, said, "Our trucks stopped because of empty tanks. Theirs stopped only for rest." As the campaign turned toward Sicily, the last convoys rolled north through Bizerte. Eckhardt and Römer, the same captured officers who had watched the first landings, were shipped to a POW camp near Algiers. From their barracks, they could still smell the same sweet, sharp perfume of fuel carried by sea wind. "They pour gasoline like we pour water," Römer muttered. His words echoed a truth that every German staff officer would soon understand. American logistics was not a system, it was an ocean of steel drums, jerrycans, and liberty ships, all moving in rhythm. It could lose a convoy and never notice. It could spill 1,000 gallons and never feel regret. By the time the last fires died in Tunisia, the German army had learned a phrase that would follow it from Africa to Normandy. Die Amerikaner kämpfen mit Benzin, the Americans fight with gasoline. And they did. They fought with it, drowned in it, and carried it forward like a flag, the scent of a new kind of warfare rising from every road, every can, every mile of mud that gleamed under the African sun. June 1943. The campaign in North Africa was over. Axis columns surrendered in droves hundreds of thousands of men, their vehicles dry, engines cold, gas tanks empty. The desert wind carried a new sound now, the deep mechanical thunder of American armor moving east, toward ports, staging for the next invasion. At Bizerte, the docks were alive again, this time with men of the U.S. Army's 1st and 9th Armored Divisions preparing to redeploy. Beside them worked longshoremen, engineers, and quartermasters, building what one German observer later called an industrial river of fuel. Barrels of motor gasoline rolled down chutes, stacked in columns, craned aboard ships until they seemed part of the vessel's hull. Each barrel bore the same stenciled words: gasoline, motor, 80 octane. Among the prisoners detailed to labor there were several German officers whose curiosity overrode bitterness. They watched, counted, and tried to make sense of what they saw. 3 million litres at this pier alone, said Oberleutnant Römer, using a clipboard scavenged from an American crate. If this is daily throughput. He stopped, running the numbers in his head, then whistled softly. It cannot be. Hauptmann Eckhardt, older and wearier, glanced over the rail where another line of trucks waited. It is, and if they can feed this here, what will they feed in Italy? Neither man could know that behind this spectacle lay an entire unseen continent of motion. Pipelines stretching from Texas to New Jersey, tank farms near Baton Rouge holding 50 million barrels, convoys of railroad tank cars a mile long. The United States was producing oil at a rate beyond imagination, over 1.5 billion barrels a year, more than the Axis combined could dream of. The German army, bred on arithmetic and scarcity, could not fathom abundance that ignored the limits of calculation. In Berlin, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht reviewed reports from Tunisia and concluded that American tactics were wasteful but effective, dependent on impossible volumes of fuel. The phrase became a refrain, impossible volumes. Yet what was impossible for Europe had become ordinary for America. The mathematics of fire, as an American petroleum officer later called it, was simple. Every Sherman tank consumed roughly 1 gallon per mile, every truck about 1 for every 4. A full armored division on the move over 6,000 vehicles burned 100,000 gallons a day. Multiply by dozens of divisions, add the Air Corps, the Navy, the transports, and the answer was staggering: millions of gallons daily. To sustain this, The Americans had not tightened belts, they had built belts longer. In 1943, the US constructed a new pipeline across North Africa, from Algiers to Bizerte, capable of moving 50,000 gallons an hour. Fuel moved continuously, indifferent to time zones, weather, or fatigue. Quartermasters called it liquid logistics. The Germans called it witchcraft. An intercepted American supply manual, translated by the Abwehr that summer, caused consternation in Berlin. It stated plainly, "All ground vehicles of the United States Army, regardless of type, shall operate on standard motor gasoline." The policy horrified German fuel planners. Such uniformity defied the entire German system, which separated diesel for armor, gasoline for staff cars, kerosene for generators. To the Americans, one fuel meant one supply chain and no confusion. That simplicity created power. In July, as preparations began for the invasion of Sicily, American fuel depots swelled to bursting. Engineers constructed wooden causeways for tanker trucks that ran day and night, pumping gasoline directly into landing craft. On the eve of the assault, Allied vessels offshore carried over 50 million gallons of motor fuel, enough to run the entire German Panzerwaffe for a month. In a German POW camp near Oran, interrogators questioned Oberleutnant Ernst Gerlach, a logistics officer captured with the Afrika Korps. When asked to describe his greatest shock, he didn't mention tanks or planes. He said, "The Americans filled trucks and tanks with the same spirit we used for automobiles before the war. They light it, they spill it, they waste it. But it is not waste if one cannot exhaust it." We learned then that we were a poor army fighting a rich one. That richness had consequences. For American troops, gasoline defined the rhythm of their days. Every operation began with fuel and ended with fuel. Maps were annotated not only with enemy positions but with refueling points and estimated consumption. Commanders measured distance not in miles but in gallons. Even the smell became iconic, sharp, oily, metallic. It clung to uniforms and rations alike. War correspondents noted that wherever an American force encamped, the air smelled of gasoline and coffee, the twin signatures of modern war. German propaganda tried to twist that into ridicule, calling the U.S. Army the benzene division. But soldiers in the field began to adopt the insult with pride. They called themselves gasoline soldiers, men whose tanks, trucks, and jeeps ran on the same fuel that powered their nation's cars and factories. By August, the first shipments of American gasoline reached British depots in Sicily through a system of floating hoses known as tombola, a prelude to the future Pluto pipelines that would later cross the English Channel. The experiment proved the concept. Armies could march by pipeline as easily as by foot. That summer, as Sherman tanks rolled through the dusty streets of Palermo, local Italians watched with astonishment. Children clapped their hands to their ears as engines roared. Mechanics wiped their hands with rags soaked in gasoline. To them, the American war machine seemed to move not on wheels but on vapor white, invisible, inexhaustible. German officers, watching the fall of Sicily from across the Strait of Messina, took note. One colonel wrote in his diary, "They advance as if the earth itself refuels them." And in a way, it did. For the Americans, oil was not a commodity. It was geography, a homeland, asset shipped whole across oceans, transforming into motion and flame wherever the flag advanced. The smell of gasoline that once astonished prisoners at Bizerte had become the scent of the age, the fragrance of industrial warfare. Wherever it lingered, it marked territory not just occupied, but supplied. And that, as the German General Staff was beginning to understand, was the new arithmetic of war. Fire could be counted not in shells or sorties, but in gallons. And in that reckoning, America had already won. September 1943, Naples Harbor. The city still smoked from air raids, the sea mottled with oil slicks from sunken ships. But beyond the ruins, the cranes moved again, unloading tankers and liberty ships filled not with ammunition, but with fuel gasoline. thousands of tons of it, as essential as oxygen to an army that had crossed 2 continents by the grace of combustion. Colonel Hal Standish, Petroleum Section, 5th U.S. Army, walked the wharf with clipboard under his arm. Around him, Italian dockhands under supervision of American engineers rolled drums down gangplanks, each marked with white stencils. Gasoline motor, 80 octane, U.S. Army. The men worked in silence except for the thump of metal and the hiss of hoses. Every sound on that pier meant movement tomorrow. On a temporary map spread across a crate, Standish traced lines in red pencil. They began at Naples, then forked north along highways and secondary roads toward Caserta, Benevento, and Foggia. Each red line represented not a combat unit but a fuel column, a convoy of tankers, each carrying 5,000 gallons. The map of Italy, for the Americans, had become a map of gallons. The Army's language itself was changing. Staff reports spoke of fuel days and mileage reserves. Every armoured advance was preceded by the question, how many gallons to Rome? Each answer meant another ship, another convoy, another miracle of American logistics made to look routine. For the Germans, watching from the other side of the Apennines, the reports from their field intelligence units were bewildering. One dispatch from 10th Army Headquarters, dated October 2nd, 1943, read, "Enemy armoured columns advancing north possess mobility inconsistent with our calculations. Their logistical methods appear to disregard fuel limitations. It is possible they have discovered substitute fuels or new refining methods. They had not. The Americans had simply learned to weaponize abundance. The new doctrine was called pipeline logistics." In October, engineers of the 697th Engineer Petroleum Distribution Company began laying flexible pipe north from the port. It snaked across farmland, through villages, under bridges. Pumping stations were assembled from prefabricated kits, motors, filters, valves, all stamped with serial numbers from Ohio and Pennsylvania. Every 30 miles, the engineers installed booster pumps, converting gasoline into an invisible river that flowed uphill toward the front. In less than 3 weeks, the red line from Naples to Foggia was complete 160 miles of pipe, carrying 500,000 gallons per day. German reconnaissance planes photographed it repeatedly, but mistook it for an abandoned water line. The idea that an army could pipe its fuel across a continent seemed fantastical, yet the flow never stopped. Even during air raids, when docks burned and ships sank, other tankers arrived. America's oil empire spanned oceans, crude from Texas, refined in Baton Rouge or Baytown, shipped through the Caribbean to Gibraltar, then across to Italy. Each step was synchronized with military precision. If a convoy was lost, another filled its place before the paperwork even reached Washington. The U.S. Army's quartermasters had turned petroleum into tempo. When Patton's men drove their Shermans north, refueling points were established like stepping stones every 30 miles. The field orders read like a catechism: refuel before contact, refuel during pursuit, refuel after victory. The fuel dumps themselves became miniature cities, thousands of drums stacked under camouflage netting, guarded by MPs who understood that one stray cigarette could ignite an apocalypse. The smell carried for miles, sharp and metallic, clinging to uniforms and dust. War correspondents joked that you could follow an American advance by scent alone. At the same time, the Germans were learning a new vocabulary of despair. Brennstoff-Mangel fuel shortage appeared in nearly every Wehrmacht log. Panzer units hoarded every litre, sometimes draining staff cars to fill tanks for a single counterattack. Crews siphoned from wrecked vehicles, then fought over the residue. The Luftwaffe grounded entire squadrons to save aviation gasoline for reconnaissance flights. Captured German diaries from the Italian front show a recurring theme: disbelief. One tank commander wrote, "The Americans drive, without limit. They burn petrol like air. They never stop. It is not an army, it is an industry on wheels." To American soldiers, the abundance was both invisible and absolute. Few stopped to think about the chain that linked the fuel in their tanks to refineries 10,000 miles away. It was simply there like sunlight or gravity. When a jeep sputtered, another truck appeared. When a tank ran dry, a refueling column materialized from dust. The miracle was hidden inside bureaucracy, requisition forms, stock records, ship manifests. It was a war fought as much by accountants as by gunners. By late autumn, the Red Line had reached Foggia, feeding not only tanks but aircraft. The newly captured airfields became staging grounds for the 15th Air Force. Their B-24s and B-17s drank gasoline by the tens of thousands of gallons each day. Engineers installed booster pumps to push the fuel uphill, connecting depots to runways. For the first time, American bombers took off from Italian soil fueled entirely by American gasoline, refined, shipped, pumped, and delivered without interruption. The Luftwaffe pilots who intercepted those formations in late 1943 noticed something else: the frequency. There were always more bombers, always more contrails, always more engines roaring on high-octane fuel that Germany could no longer afford. In November, a German technical officer interrogated in Bari summed it up in a single sentence recorded by the Allied translator and interpreter section. For every one of our tanks, you have 10 cans of fuel waiting somewhere. That is the difference. He was right. The Americans no longer thought of gasoline as a resource. It was momentum itself, a measure of distance, strategy, and time. Each gallon was a unit of power, and each pipeline, truck, and drum was an artery in a mechanical organism that now spanned half the world. By winter, the German generals studying those fuel reports were beginning to understand what had once seemed madness in Tunisia. An army that ran on gasoline was not reckless, it was inevitable. And as the smell of octane drifted north with every mile gained, the myth of American excess became the new logic of modern war. December 1943. Somewhere between Naples and Cassino, the road wound upward through mud and stone. Convoys crawled past wrecked bridges, detoured through shattered villages, and yet never stopped. Under canvas tarpaulins, trucks marked Pol, gasoline rattled north, their cargo sloshing with every turn. The mountain air reeked of cordite, pine smoke, and fuel. Major Samuel Mac McCrary of the 697th Engineer Petroleum Distribution Company leaned against his jeep, watching a bulldozer clear debris from a collapsed culvert. Behind him, a column of tanker trucks idled, engines muttering. Each truck carried 5,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to feed a battalion of Shermans for a single day's push. McCrary's mission was not glory but gravity, to keep the Red Line, the pipeline artery that had begun at Naples, alive through the winter mud. He scribbled in his logbook, "Flow steady at 30,000 gallons per hour. Casualties: 2 trucks burned, 1 driver lost." Then he looked at the pipe itself, a gleaming black snake half buried in the ditch, its joints sealed with tar and determination. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the battle for Monte Cassino thundered, the monastery already a silhouette of rubble. But behind every gun and tank was his pipeline, pumping invisibly uphill, turning America's oil fields into artillery. The German High Command could not comprehend it. From Rome, intercepted signals revealed growing alarm. One message from General Heinrich von Vietinghoff's staff read, "Enemy fuel supply apparently uninterrupted despite bombings. Intelligence reports subterranean tanks or hidden reserves." In Berlin, the Reich's fuel ministry demanded confirmation. The answer came, "Back bleak. Their reserves are the sea itself." By late 1943, the Allied armies in Italy consumed nearly 2 million gallons of motor gasoline per day. The numbers were obscene by German standards. Yet for the Americans, they were merely statistics. Ships arrived, pipes carried, drums rolled, everything governed by an industrial rhythm. Refineries in Texas and Louisiana had increased output by 50% since Pearl Harbor. Even the synthetic rubber plants in Akron produced hoses for the very lines now threading through Italy's hills. To the men at the front, it was a miracle sustained by ordinary labor. Every can, every drop, passed through a dozen hands. Italian civilians, employed by the Quartermaster Corps, carried jerrycans on mules through mountain passes. GIs rigged siphon pumps from motorcycle engines. When snow clogged the roads, engineers built sleds for drums. And always, the gasoline came. The smell of it defined their world. A veteran from the first, Armored Division later recalled, "We could smell it before we saw it, the gas, the oil, the exhaust. It meant we were still moving. If you didn't smell it, you started to worry." In contrast, the German 10th Army was freezing in place. Reports from their Panzer Grenadier units near Cassino listed fuel rations as catastrophic, less than 50 litres per vehicle per day. Engines were run only to reposition guns or evacuate wounded. The Wehrmacht's once mighty mobility had been reduced to horse carts and human muscle. What gasoline remained was hoarded for headquarters vehicles and armoured reserves that rarely moved. One captured German captain, interrogated by U.S. Teen Corps in January 1944, described his astonishment. "We destroyed a bridge near San Vittore, certain the Americans could not cross with tanks. 2 days later, they were on the other side. We found they had built a new bridge of fuel drums welded together, filled with their cursed gasoline. That improvisation was not madness but method. American engineers had learned to use fuel as both weapon and tool. Gasoline-powered pumps for pontoons, generators for hospitals, stoves for field kitchens, even the torches that cut steel. It illuminated tents at midnight and set the battlefield alight when spilled. Aerial reconnaissance showed the enemy what they could not understand. Depots burning like cities, yet replaced within days. In January, the Luftwaffe bombed the port of Naples, hitting tank farms and igniting millions of gallons. The fire burned for 3 days, sending black plumes miles into the sky. Yet within a week, tanker ships had refilled every depot. An intelligence report from the German Navy concluded grimly, "The Americans possess a second ocean underground." Even German civilians began to hear of the gasoline war. Goebbels's propaganda ministry warned of Benzinkrieg, a conflict decided not by courage but by combustion. But the message backfired. Among soldiers at the front, Benzinkrieg became a term of dread, shorthand for an enemy that never ran out. Meanwhile, the Americans were turning gasoline into strategy. At Allied headquarters in Algiers, General Brehon Sommervel, commander of the Army Service Forces, outlined a doctrine that would later guide the invasion of France. Mobility equals firepower. Fuel is the ammunition of movement. Under his system, fuel planning became the first step of every operation. Tanks could be replaced, trucks repaired but without gasoline. Divisions became statues. In the ruins of Cassino that February, the contrast was complete. German tanks stood abandoned, drained dry by retreating crews. American Shermans idled past, their radial engines roaring, exhaust plumes glimmering in the cold dawn. To the weary infantry watching them roll by, it was proof of something larger than victory, it was proof of permanence. Colonel Standish, inspecting a new depot carved into the hillside near Mignano, summed it up in a letter to Washington. "We have turned the Apennines into a refinery. Every drop of gas here is a drop of the Mississippi, the Gulf, the Pacific coast. The men don't know it, but when they pour a can into a tank, they are pouring home into the war." Across the lines, German engineers studied the captured cans and pumps, shaking their heads. "We design engines," one said bitterly, "but they design supply." By the end of that winter, the Americans had done more than supply an army. They had invented a new kind of empire. It had no colonies, no borders, no flags of conquest. Its dominion was measured in octane, and its citizens were tankers, drivers, and mechanics. They called it the Petroleum Age. And its capital, for now, was wherever a jerrycan gleamed in the sun. June 1944, the English south coast thundered without rest. From Portsmouth to Weymouth, ships lined the horizon, Liberty hulls, LSTs, oilers, each a moving lung in an industrial organism about to breathe fire across the channel. Above the noise of engines and cranes came another rhythm, the hiss of pumps, the metallic clatter of hoses, and the steady pulse of fuel. The invasion fleet was not only an armada of men and guns, it was a river of gasoline preparing to flow east. Colonel Standish had arrived from Italy to oversee petroleum operations for Operation Overlord. He had seen the Red Line in North Africa, the pipelines through the Apennines, the storage farms that burned and resurrected themselves. But this was larger. Here, engineers of the British Petroleum Board and US Army Services were building something entirely new, pipeline under the ocean, or Pluto. It was a mad idea. Stretch 2 continuous pipes from England to France under the Channel, each capable of carrying 1 million gallons of gasoline a day. The Germans had radar, submarines, and mines, yet the Allies intended to run a secret artery beneath their feet. "It's not a plan," Standish had told his staff dryly. "It's a bet, and we're betting the war runs on octane." In the assembly yards of Dungeness, the coils of pipe glistened like enormous steel serpents. Some were flexible Hamel types wound around massive spools, others rigid Hayes cables built by submarine companies. When tested, they pulsed with life fuel racing through at 60 miles an hour. While engineers laid pipe, the armies prepared to drink. Each landing craft carried 55-gallon drums lashed to its deck. The first waves at Omaha and Utah would land with full tanks, enough for 48 hours of fighting. After that, everything depended on the floating ports and the tankers waiting offshore. The Allies had built no fewer than 12 artificial harbours, mulberries, each with fuel barges hidden among their pontoons. On the eve of D-Day, June 5, 1944, the entire Channel coast glowed with light despite blackout orders. It was the reflection of welding, torches, lanterns, and the flicker of gasoline fires where engines tested in the dark. The air smelled of salt, tar, and octane. For the men waiting to board, it was the scent of fate. When the invasion began, fuel became the measure of momentum. By the end of June 6th, the Allies had put over 150,000 men ashore and consumed nearly 2 million gallons of motor gasoline. Tanker trucks rolled down steel causeways, their engines idling as they pumped directly into fuel bladders buried behind the dunes. Soldiers called them gasoline coffins, long rubber tanks that bulged under the weight of liquid fire. German reconnaissance photographs of the Normandy beaches taken a week later baffled analysts. They expected to see fuel shortages crippling the Allied armour. Instead, they saw constant truck movement, tank formations advancing inland, and, impossibly, ships arriving faster than they could count. One Luftwaffe report concluded, "The enemy's petroleum reserves appear inexhaustible. They must be supplied by underwater storage or an unknown process." By mid-July, the first Pluto line, codenamed Bambi, was operational from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. Fuel pressure stabilized at 700 pounds per square inch. The pumps at Sandown roared like locomotives. Within hours, the pipeline was feeding the first tank farms in France. The Germans never discovered it. They bombed bridges, railheads, even decoy depots, but the real lifeline ran unseen beneath the sea. Standish visited the pumping station on July 22nd. The operators worked bare-chested in the heat, their hands black with grease. Gauges trembled, valves hissed, and the smell of gasoline filled the room. He ran his fingers along the warm pipe and murmured, "The Mississippi flows to Normandy now." Behind the front, the Red Ball Express took over a ceaseless convoy of trucks, ferrying gasoline, ammunition, and rations from the ports to the spearheads. From August through November, 6,000 vehicles ran day and night across France. Each truck carried 75 cans of gasoline. Each driver averaged 300 miles a day. The convoy commanders joked that they weren't soldiers, they were veins. German fuel reports from that period read like autopsies. Panzergruppe West unable to execute counterattack, fuel reserves under 10%. Air resupply impossible. Even elite divisions sat immobilized, their engines silent. The Americans, meanwhile, burned 10 times that amount daily and sent for more. Captured German officers interrogated after the breakout at Saint-Lô voiced the same disbelief expressed a year earlier in Tunisia. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, told his interrogator, "Your tanks run on aviation spirit. It should explode. It should kill your crews. And yet you make it work, as if your factories have found a way to turn fire into metal." He wasn't far from the truth. Aviation, gasoline refined for P-40s and P-51s, now powered Shermans and half-tracks. The US refining system had erased the distinction between fuels. Everything that burned could be used. Engineers even blended surplus toluene from bomb plants into motor fuel, creating mixtures of terrifying volatility but perfect consistency. Everywhere the Allies went, they left a sheen of gasoline on the earth. In villages, children learned the word essence before freedom. Mechanics washed parts in it, cooks lit fires with it, and soldiers baptized cigarettes in it before lighting. It was the signature of victory, a chemical flag. By September, as Patton's Third Army approached the German border, the phrase gasoline shortfall appeared for the first time in Allied records, not because production had failed, but because success had outrun delivery. Patton's tanks had advanced 200 miles in less than 2 weeks, faster than the pipelines could crawl. The result was a paradox, an army rich in fuel yet stranded by speed. At Supreme Headquarters, Standish reviewed the reports and smiled wryly. "Even abundance," he wrote, "has a limit the rate at which you can pour it into the war." But by October, the Pluto lines doubled in capacity, and the flow resumed. The German generals who studied these miracles after the war would call it der unsichtbare Strom, the invisible current. It had begun with drums on African docks, grown through Italian hills, and now crossed the channel itself. It was not a stream of metal or men, but of energy refined, shipped, and burned without pause. When the first American armor breached the Siegfried Line that winter, the Germans at last understood. The Allies had not merely crossed the channel, they had brought the entire petroleum age with them, and the sound that filled those frozen valleys, more than gunfire or engines, was the endless, rhythmic pulse of fuel moving forward, America's quiet thunder, roaring beneath the world. December 1944. The Ardennes forest slept under snow, but beneath that silence lay engines, thousands of them, cold and hungry. American tank crews huddled in foxholes beside their Shermans, waiting for the next convoy of gasoline trucks. To the west, German panzers moved too quiet, determined, and almost empty. Both armies knew the same truth. This war was no longer measured in bullets or miles, but in gallons. The German offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge began not with guns, but with hoarded fuel. Hitler's last gamble depended on capturing Allied depots intact. "Without American gasoline," he told his generals, "we cannot reach Antwerp." In Berlin, petroleum mathematicians scribbled their grim calculations. A panzer division consumed 120,000 litres per day. The entire offensive required over 10 million. The Reich's total stockpile barely matched half that. At the forward command post, near Eifel, a colonel from the German quartermaster corps whispered to his aide as the tanks rolled out, "If they burn 1 litre too many, the attack dies before Christmas." Meanwhile, at a small logistics hub in Liège, Colonel Hal Standish, now Chief of Fuel Supply for 12th Army Group, pored over maps dotted with red circles marking depots. He knew the Germans would strike for them. Gasoline had become both treasure and target. Each red circle on his chart was a potential catastrophe. 20,000 gallons of volatile promise stacked in thin-walled drums, guarded by tired MPs and snowbound engineers. On December 16, 1944, the storm broke. German armoured columns smashed through the fog, overrunning American supply dumps near Street Vith and Clairvaux. They captured trucks, jeeps, and precious fuel. But their victory was arithmetic, not strategy. Every mile gained burned more of the prize. One captured Sherman was refueled and turned east, then ran dry, and within hours, abandoned by the roadside. American intelligence decoded radio traffic by December 19th. One message from a German panzer regiment read simply, "Fuel exhausted, vehicles abandoned, infantry continuing on foot." The counterattack that had begun as blitzkrieg ended as pilgrimage. At the same moment, Allied depots to the west exploded into motion. The Red Ball Express, disbanded months earlier, was reassembled overnight. Within 72 hours, 5,000 trucks were hauling fuel from Cherbourg to the front. Drivers slept in their cabs, drinking scalding coffee from tin mugs that smelled faintly of gasoline. Snow, mud, and strafing aircraft turned the convoys into moving miracles. Yet they rolled, mile after mile, carrying the invisible lifeblood that would turn the tide. In Bastogne, surrounded and freezing, American paratroopers rationed everything except courage. Fuel for the few working vehicles was poured from jerrycans carried by hand through the snow. When the 101st Airborne's small tank detachment prepared for a counterattack, they siphoned gasoline from wrecked jeeps. One lieutenant scrawled in his diary, "We burn what burns, trucks, rations, even hope, but still we fight." Then, just before Christmas, the skies cleared. From airfields in England and France, hundreds of C-47 seconds took off carrying parachute drums of fuel and ammunition. The first barrels dropped through icy wind into Bastogne's perimeter, bouncing like thunder along the frozen fields. Men scrambled to cut the chutes and drag the drums to waiting Shermans. The gasoline steamed as it hit the cold, its vapor sharp as acid. One tank commander shouted to his crew, "Merry Christmas, boys, it's the smell of survival." For the Germans, that same smell had become poison. Their captured depots were empty, their trucks immobilized. By the last week of December, most panzer units reported less than 20% of required fuel. Crews drained the tanks of wrecked vehicles, mixed aviation fuel with diesel, even tried heating frozen oil in their helmets. Nothing worked. The mighty armoured spearhead had become a graveyard of machines. When Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve Bastogne, his supply columns moved with terrifying precision. Engineers measured success not in victories, but in gallons per mile. Patton's staff had calculated the entire advance like an accountant balancing fire. 300,000 gallons per day, 10 gallons per mile, 7 miles per hour, 1 victory per sunrise. The contrast was absolute. The Germans fought on empty tanks, the Americans on full ones. At an interrogation center near Spa, a captured German colonel stared in disbelief at a line of American fuel trucks stretching over the hills. He murmured, "You fight with oceans, we fight with thimbles." By New Year's Eve, the offensive was broken. The few surviving panzers limped east, engines coughing, drivers praying for fuel that never came. Allied aircraft strafed the retreating columns, their machine guns igniting the last gasoline reserves. The valleys burned for days, a funeral pyre for an idea that willpower could replace supply. After the battle, American fuel officers toured the wreckage. Standish walked among the blackened hulks, his boots crunching on frozen earth soaked with fuel and blood. He paused beside a Panther tank, its engine compartment blasted open, jerrycans still lashed to the rear. He noted the stenciled word benzin, written in careful Gothic script. Then he looked at the miles of American trucks idling in the distance and whispered, "Arithmetic 1. At 12th Army Group Headquarters, the final report summarized it without poetry. Allied daily fuel consumption, 2 million gallons. German availability, less than 200,000. The battle was decided by 10-1. When the report reached Washington, a marginal note from General Somervell read, "Fuel is not merely supply, it is strategy." Historians would later call the Battle of the Bulge the last German offensive. In truth, it was the last illusion that courage could outrun combustion. When the snow melted, the fields of the Ardennes were littered with the carcasses of engines that had died of thirst. For the Germans, gasoline had been a mystery since Tunisia. For the Americans, it had become faith. From the docks of Bizerte to the forests of Belgium, they had proven one immutable law of modern war. Power does not belong to those who fight hardest, but to those who can keep their engines running. And so, in that frozen December of 1944, The smell of gasoline and coffee, still mingling in every depot, became the scent of victory itself.